Mining concessions and environmental reckoning. Mining is drawing some of the sharpest lines in Greenland's national debate. In May 2025, the government granted a 30-year permit to Greenland and Ilulissat Mining, a firm backed by the Gene Boole Group alongside Greenlandic investment funds. The project aims to extract anorthosite, a mineral useful in aluminum and fiberglass production, from deposits in southwest Greenland. Officials promoted the concession as a practical step toward building new streams of revenue. But the move also highlighted how much is at stake when industrial development arrives in fragile Arctic landscapes. Kvanefield, once the centerpiece of Greenland's mining ambitions, remains stalled by the country's uranium ban enacted in 2021. That law prohibits uranium extraction as either a primary or secondary activity, effectively barring energy transition minerals, formerly Greenland Minerals, from proceeding with its planned rare earths venture. The company has since launched arbitration claims against Greenland for substantial damages, warning of billions in lost opportunities. While specific figures remain contested, the litigation signals that the government is exposed not only to environmental and political risk, but also to prolonged legal battles with international investors. For Greenlandic leaders, the economic rationale appears straightforward. Danish subsidies account for a large share of public finance, and resource development is one of the few plausible paths to reduce this dependence. Mining royalties and related taxes could, in theory, fund public services and strengthen arguments for greater autonomy. Supporters portray projects like GAM's anorthosite concession as test cases for building national capacity in resource governance, offering a chance to participate in global supply chains tied to green technologies. Yet the promise collides with stark environmental and social realities. Mining today employs less than 0.5% of Greenland's workforce, according to National Banken, and most major deposits remain far from commercial production. Greenland has only a handful of small mines in operation, and nearly all the large-scale projects remain in exploration or financing stages. Environmental assessments emphasize that mining in Greenland is not an abstract scenario, but a source of direct risk to other established sectors. At Kvanefield, runoff from waste rock could seep into fjords vital for cod and halibut, jeopardizing both exports and subsistence fishing. In Disco Bay, exploration activities interact with permafrost zones that are already destabilizing due to warming. Thawing ground threatens infrastructure while potentially releasing naturally occurring pollutants into meltwater streams. Cold Arctic conditions mean contaminants would persist longer than in temperate regions, raising the risk of long-term impacts. Local communities rely on these fjords and waterways not only for fisheries income, but also for drinking water, tourism activities, and subsistence hunts. The clash is not merely environmental versus economic. Tourism is marketed on Greenland's clean wilderness and pristine landscapes. Visible mining footprints, exploration roads, drilling platforms, or tailings facilities risk reshaping the international image that underpins growth in tourism revenue. Fishing, which still dominates Greenland's export economy, could also be undercut if global buyers perceive contamination risks. Leaders in Nuuk face the difficulty of aligning policies across multiple sectors, each of which is sensitive to environmental integrity and global reputation. Another layer of tension lies in who gains from these projects. Mining requires specialized labor and capital intensity. While construction phases offer temporary local hiring, many skilled jobs and contracts go abroad to experienced technicians and engineering firms. Critics warn that once the initial build-out passes, towns may be left with fewer permanent roles than promised, reinforcing patterns of dependency. Small communities hosting the sites bear the environmental burden and disruption, while uncertain about long-term employment. Foreign involvement magnifies these concerns. Mining concessions typically involve companies linked to larger state-backed enterprises or foreign investors with global supply chains. For Greenland, that introduces a contradiction. Resource revenues could advance economic independence from Denmark, but heavy reliance on outside firms risks shifting influence elsewhere. Environmental standards, waste management decisions, and export terms often fall under strategies driven more by corporate or foreign government priorities than by local communities. This question of sovereignty, control over how resources are extracted, processed, and sold, emerges repeatedly in debates at town meetings and parliamentary sessions. On the regulatory side, Greenland has struggled to keep pace with the complexity of industrial mining. Environmental frameworks exist, but enforcement capacity is limited in remote areas. Systems to contain waste or stabilize permafrost infrastructure are often modeled on temperate climates and may not withstand Greenland's intense freeze-thaw cycles, heavy snowmelt surges, or coastal erosion. The logistical costs of monitoring remote concessions add further challenge. Observers argue that every new concession compounds these pressures. requiring layers of governance that Greenland has not yet fully developed. Public opinion reflects these trade-offs. In towns near proposed sites, meetings regularly highlight the divide between enthusiasm for jobs and fears about long-term ecological damage. Parents raising children in areas dependent on fishing camps emphasize the risk of polluted fjords, while younger job seekers point to limited opportunities outside seasonal tourism. Some residents accept exploration with caution provided strict oversight is enforced. Others argue no management system can realistically eliminate risks. The result is a patchwork of local perspectives, often shaped by proximity to proposed projects and by the memory of how previous promises unfolded. Across Greenland, the discussion connects directly to the country's larger identity. Leaders who frame mining revenues as a route toward independence contend that failing to develop resources means remaining in a position of permanent dependency. Environmental and community advocates respond that pursuing mining without absolute safeguards risks undermining the very sectors, fishing and tourism, that allow Greenland to sustain itself. The central choice is not only about income, but about what values and images Greenland should project. A frontier of resource extraction or a society that prioritizes ecological resilience. As ice retreats in parts of South Greenland and exploration moves forward in Disco Bay, machinery already leaves visible marks across shorelines once defined by isolation. New roads cut across landscapes used for hunting. Storage depots rise near fjords that communities rely upon for daily life. The scale of intervention may be small compared to global mining operations, but in settlements of only a few thousand, such changes reshape the environment in noticeable ways. Each exploration license becomes a symbol of the broader dilemma. How much of the environment can be traded for revenue, and who decides the acceptable threshold? The conflict narrows into a dilemma that is both immediate and long-term. Mining offers royalties that could reduce reliance on external subsidies and finance housing, schools, and energy infrastructure. It also carries the possibility of permafrost collapse, water contamination, and damage to Greenland's most valuable fisheries and tourism assets. For a nation with under 60,000 people, the weight of these trade-offs falls unevenly on small communities nearest the mines, where ecosystems and livelihoods are directly intertwined. The concessions already approved prove that Greenland is not immune to global demand for critical minerals. But each step forward carries costs that show up quickly in fragile coastal towns. Whether mining becomes a cornerstone of national independence or a trigger for environmental and social disruption is not yet resolved, and it is unfolding in a moment when Greenland is under increasing scrutiny from abroad. The shadow of superpowers. Greenland's reputation as a quiet, distant territory is giving way to one shaped more by the interests of global powers than by its own ambitions. By 2025, this reality is clearer than ever. Chinese state-linked companies have expressed serious interest in Greenland's critical minerals, while American firms, supported by signals from Washington, seek to establish supply alternatives aligned with national security priorities. Russia focuses mostly on its own Arctic coastline and shipping networks, but still treats the waters north of Greenland as part of its wider strategic environment. These trends attract attention not only in Nuuk, but across global capitals. What was once seen as remote rivalry now finds concrete expression in Greenland's policy choices. A mining permit signed in Nuuk is discussed abroad as a marker of strategic alignment. A U.S. diplomatic visit is analyzed for its implications in Beijing. Chinese discussions of partnerships are debated in Washington. The language of contracts and development for Greenlanders often reads abroad like signals on a competitive board of influence. The Arctic once symbolized wilderness, but today it is cast as a frontier of strategy. China's declared status as a near-Arctic state underlines why its interest draws notice. Rare earth elements and critical minerals essential for electronics and defense systems sit at the heart of this attention. Chinese firms dominate much of the global market, but diversification through Arctic access would consolidate their position. In Greenland, several proposed partnerships and investments have emerged across the past decade, yet many of them have been slowed, blocked, or withdrawn. Some exploration bids never advanced to full approval, and others faced pushback from both Danish authorities and Greenlandic political leaders wary of over-reliance. This means China's current footprint in Greenland is limited, even if its ambitions are not. Observers emphasize this gap. Beijing's interest remains strong, but so far it has not translated into lasting control on the ground. The United States frames Greenland differently. American officials emphasize the need for supply chains independent of China. From the vantage of Washington, Greenland's potential mineral output is less about domestic Greenlandic economics and more about securing resources for defense industries and reducing dependency. Here, strategic weight comes not just from mining ventures but from already established defense arrangements. Under the long-standing U.S. Denmark security framework, the U.S. maintains operations at Pitifik Air Base, formerly Thule, used for missile warning and space surveillance. This base highlights Washington's historical presence and demonstrates why diplomatic signaling in 2025 carries tangible weight. For U.S. policymakers, Greenland is not simply an economic prospect but a cornerstone in Arctic defense. Russia's posture differs. Moscow's Arctic expansion is concentrated along its own northern coastline, where it has invested heavily in icebreakers, ports, and bases. Melting ice is opening the northern sea route with greater reliability, and Russia treats this as a future trade lifeline. While Greenland is not a site of Russian economic projects or military installations, its position along the North Atlantic means that changing maritime patterns increasingly touch its environment. Russia's naval capacity and shipping policies redefine the High North broadly, but experts stress that this activity does not yet translate to a sustained Russian presence in Greenlandic waters themselves. Greenland features in Moscow's calculations indirectly, more as a reference point than as a focal target. This distinction matters. Analysts at institutions such as DIIS and Belfer caution against overstating direct Sino-Russian footprints in Greenland. Sino-Russian cooperation in the Arctic to date is largely limited to energy and shipping projects within Russian territory. The image of heavily armed Russian patrols or significant Chinese port control in Greenland is not supported by current developments. Instead, the influence is subtler: investment bids, diplomatic visits, and rhetorical positioning. The perception of rivalry is real, but the material presence is more modest than headlines often suggest. For Greenlandic politics, this external attention carries weight far above local scale. Every contract or partnership is scrutinized internationally. A potential concession to a Chinese company is immediately read as a geopolitical tilt. Welcoming American investment is seen abroad as an exclusion of rivals. Danish authorities responsible for Greenland's foreign and security policy weigh these choices against NATO responsibilities. Greenlandic leaders, meanwhile, attempt to emphasize community needs and sustainable development, but find themselves enveloped within global narratives they do not control. Residents feel the external gaze acutely. Mining, airport expansion, or infrastructure projects become entangled with questions about whether superpowers benefit more than local households do. Opportunities are recognized: royalties, jobs, and new connections. But alongside these, the fear grows that the interest of outsiders so outweighs local capacity that Greenland's agency risks being eroded. Political debates in Nuuk often proceed under the shadow of whether resource management is about independence or about becoming a lever in someone else's strategy. Diplomatic visits reinforce this dynamic. American officials stress defense cooperation and emphasize partnership within NATO. Chinese delegations highlight mutual benefit through investment and development. Russian representatives frame the Arctic in terms of cooperative opportunities, but continue to expand infrastructure near their own northern ports. These gestures appear respectful, but observers note how they are interpreted abroad as signs of rivalry. To local communities, this kind of high-level attention can bring investment and recognition. To outsiders, each visit signals the distribution of influence and access to Arctic resources. Some analysts warn that the atmosphere looks like a repeat of Cold War logics. Greenland's history with U.S. military bases underscores this parallel. During that era, its geography made it essential to early warning systems. Today, the instruments are different: fewer troop movements, more industrial contracts, but the underlying competition echoes historical precedents. Energy resources, shipping corridors, and mineral deposits all carry weight as tokens of strategic power. For Greenland's government, the scale of outside interest brings unusual pressure. Its population and administrative resources are small, yet its decisions trigger extensive global interpretation. A simple choice to welcome or decline a foreign concession can be amplified abroad as proof of allegiance to East or West. Local leaders discuss jobs and infrastructure, while outside commentators analyze strategy. The gap between intention and interpretation leaves Greenland exposed to narratives it does not fully shape. Geography intensifies this. Between North America and Europe, and close to emerging Arctic routes, Greenland cannot avoid strategic consideration. Its location magnifies interest in ways that exceed its population's capacity to manage easily. Officials call for decisions rooted in community needs and sustainable growth, but in external media, these are presented as alignments within rivalry. The larger power's shadow stretches across everyday policymaking, whether it concerns minerals, shipping, or fisheries. Experts stress the need to balance hype with reality. Russia's Arctic militarization is real but concentrated along its own coast. China's interest is persistent, but its Greenland projects remain few, with many blocked or delayed. The United States not only pursues minerals, but already operates the long-standing air base and defense ties. These asymmetries demonstrate that Greenland is most closely tied in practice to Washington and Copenhagen, while China and Russia's presence remains limited compared to the speculation that often surrounds their names. Yet perception matters. Even a stalled Chinese mining bid or a rejected Russian overture is enough to generate debate in NATO forums or think tank studies. Greenland is increasingly discussed in global defense papers, strategy debates, and economic forecasts. Leaders accustomed to focusing on fisheries, housing, or tourism now see their decisions carried into international discourse. Each step in Nuuk seems to resonate in conversations far beyond Greenland's borders. By 2025, isolation is no longer the marker of Greenland's global role. It is now a focal point where outside attention meets local decision-making. Superpowers see opportunities in minerals, shipping, and security, even when their footprints remain partial or limited. For Greenlanders, the task is to sustain agency while managing offers and partnerships weighed not just for local value, but also for their global implications. The real contest lies not in foreign bases or fleets surrounding Greenland, but in who shapes contracts, who gains access, and how much space remains for Greenland itself to decide. And as this dynamic intensifies, every negotiation about resources or partnerships feeds into a broader discussion that extends beyond foreign influence alone. At stake is not only what Greenland accepts or rejects from the outside, but how these decisions frame its internal political trajectory, a question increasingly difficult to separate from its search for greater self-rule. Diplomacy at a tipping point. Diplomacy has become the newest arena where Greenland finds itself under pressure. The balance of autonomy within the Kingdom of Denmark, once a steady subject for academic debate, now plays out in full public view. Under the Self-Government Act of 2009, Greenland was officially recognized as holding the right to self-determination. This legal framework established that the Greenlandic people could ultimately decide their own future, and with it, the foundations of sovereignty were laid. In 2024, Greenland reinforced this trajectory by publishing its first foreign defense and security strategy, a move that signaled its intention to claim more agency in exactly those domains Denmark still controls. These steps anchor the current debates not in speculation, but in concrete political documents that set out Greenland's expectations for the years ahead. Within this framework, Greenland's leaders are clear. Control of natural resources must lie closer to home. Fisheries, tourism, and mining are the pillars of Greenland's economy, yet the authority to approve licenses or defend territorial waters rests primarily in Copenhagen. For Greenlandic officials, the contradiction grows sharper as local communities experience rising tourism, shifting quotas, and the first large-scale mining permits. From their perspective, if these pressures can alter daily life in Nuuk, Ilulissat, or Qaqortoq, decisions about managing them should rest with Greenland's own government, not an external authority. Denmark, in turn, stresses that responsibility cannot be divided so neatly. Defense and foreign policy remain with Copenhagen, and the growing importance of the Arctic has only underscored those commitments. Over the past 2 years, Denmark and NATO have stepped up monitoring across the Arctic, discussing investments in drones, naval capacity, and additional surveillance systems. Copenhagen presents these measures as support for Greenland as much as for Denmark and its allies. Yet for many in Nuuk, the reality is harder to reconcile. They point out that security upgrades arrive quickly, while schools and hospitals still confront shortages and delays. The symbolism stirs unease. Even as Greenland is cast as vital to strategic defense, it has less control over how its economic lifelines are handled. Diplomatic exchanges reflect this strain. Communications from Greenland to Danish ministries have grown sharper, citing Greenland's record of export revenues and demanding acknowledgement that sovereignty over resources is no longer a distant ambition. International analysts see this rhetoric as proof that dialogue about independence, while still cautious, has moved into a more practical phase. The focus is not an imminent break from the Kingdom of Denmark, but a determined push to claim authority over quotas, concessions, and the flow of revenue from natural wealth. Sovereignty has slid from abstraction into a practical question of governance. The complexity deepens when viewed through the lens of NATO and wider Arctic politics. Greenland provides essential space for allied forces and monitoring systems, including the long-standing American presence at Pittafik Air Base. At the same time, NATO has announced broader Arctic monitoring initiatives, ranging from space-based surveillance to expanded patrols. For Greenlandic leaders, this highlights a disconnect. If the world depends upon their territory for global security, why should they lack equal recognition in determining how nearby fish stocks or mineral deposits are managed? It is a political argument framed in everyday terms. If global actors claim importance, the local population should share in the authority. That reasoning resonates in small towns just as fiercely as in the capital. When foreign companies apply for large concessions, Ilulissat or Maniitsoq residents see contracts negotiated in Nuuk that later appear in headlines in Beijing, Washington, or Brussels. The debate over halibut quotas for small-scale fishermen echoes into discussions over European seafood imports. The sense develops that Greenland is already implicated in major power politics, whether or not the community itself sought entry into the conversation. Residents conclude that sovereignty is not a distant legal status, but a practical shield to ensure that local priorities are not eroded by distant trade talks or security calculations. The way politicians articulate the issue reflects this shift. Past leaders spoke of gradual steps toward possible independence, leaving timelines vague. In 2025, the tone has hardened. Leaders make plain declarations that sovereignty over resources is a non-negotiable expectation. While Copenhagen views resource management as tied to defense and foreign relations, Greenland insists on separating them. From Nuuk's vantage, decisions on fisheries or mining should not be delayed or diluted by broader alliance concerns. The two perspectives are colliding, one calling for compartmentalization and the other for integration. Practical pressures fuel the rhetoric. Housing shortages in Nuuk, wage gaps in the tourism industry, and the effect of quota reform on small fishing boats demand faster solutions.